All right, it's the top of the hour, apparently. And this is 2-on-1, the internet's #1 rated talk show where two theologians engage a pop culture topic of their guests' choosing. Hello, I'm one of your co-hosts, the Reverend Arthur Stewart.
And I am your other co-host, the Reverend Stephanie Kendall. And we are, I think both of us are a little flustered at the moment because we've been having some tech issues.
And not even like fun tech issues, just like my monitor decided to completely freeze, like reset my computer, and it was still me and Spiff was like elegant, and I'm like, and so that was fun.
It's anyhow, okay. Every week I don't get to choose the photo that like pops up on, when we post this episode. And so it's always like you looking like, hey, welcome to the top of the hour, and me like eyes closed, being like half sneezing.
Like half sneeze, yeah.
Yeah. Throwback to Keely and
that makes me feel better. Yeah. Okay, so we've got a great show today, and
oh my gosh, yes,
I want to Marin a lot, but also like we're kind of late getting started, and we're both a little frustrated. So I'm gonna honor that and Ashton's time. But
we have Ashton Sorrels here today talking Bojack Horseman, which is very exciting.
It took a while for me to get into that show, but I do really like it. It's honestly like Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. You the characters like have to grow on you. They have to evolve. But we can talk about that in a second. Can we talk about that it's now rain tide? And it's going to be a weird and good and interesting rain tide this year, right?
Ordinary time is anything but this year.
I like that. As congregations begin to or continue or consider reopening, it's time to mark the newness of the season.
Create litanies of welcome and maybe grieving.
Install new leaders and celebrate, even decommission like a battleship with their blessing the folks who have done the work week in and week out and week in and week out.
Give your maybe music or worship leaders or staffing some bonus break that's paid.
And I know y'all are thinking, this is well scripted. Wow. Up your liturgical textile game with stoles, pyramids, banners, and frontals from Jeff Wunrow Designs.
For 16 years, friends, Jeff Wunrow and his team have been making ordinary time extraordinary, as we say every week. And they do that through their meticulous, creative, gorgeous liturgical textiles.
And it is now the time to up your stole game. Embrace the season of newness and possibility. Show your rear end and rip ready to go with refreshed and vibrant work from Jeff Wunrow Designs.
That was quite the tongue twister. I'm very proud of you.
Thank you.
And for our listeners and viewers, or deuces, as we have decided to call you all, which it's growing on me, Arthur. I know I was a little hesitant at first, but I love our deuces. # we are deuces. And we have a special for our deuces, our listeners and viewers. Use 2-on-1, all one word, for 15% off at checkout, your entire stole order. I just bought one and I forgot. I was like, where do I put in this code? And you have to go kind of all the way to the end, but don't click pay until you have put in 2-on-1, all one word for 15% off a whole store.
Wait, did you say whole store, the whole stole order? So like if I order 2 stoles,
15% off.
What if I buy 4 stoles?
15% off.
Okay, but surely if I were to buy 8 stoles, I don't think that I would.
15% off your entire stole order, no matter how many stoles you buy. It is the best discount that is out there. Jeff gave it to us specifically as our lead sponsor. He has been an incredible partner on this journey for all of us. I've used the code myself. I'm anxiously waiting for my new stole. I'm very excited about.
I'm anxiously waiting for it too. It's like the birth pangs of a new liturgical season, and it's time to make ordinary time extraordinary. So why not do it with folks who have been blazing that trail for the last 16 years?
Amen. Check out the full catalog and customization options at Jeff Wunrow Designs at Jeff Wunrow, JEFFWUNROW.com for 15% off by using the code 2-on-1.
Yep, these stoles still steal this show. Thank you, Jeff. Let's get to it with Ashton and Bojack Horseman. I'm going to hit the admit button.
Dun, 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 dun. This is about as close as we've ever gotten to an intro theme.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Travis, for nothing. Hi, Ashton.
Hey.
Hello. Hey.
It is so good to have you on.
So good to be here.
So thank you for coming and offering us Bojack Horseman, which I have really enjoyed. People had talked to me about it a little bit, like here and there, it's sprinkled into the conversations, but 2-on-1 forces me to watch a lot of things. And some of the stuff I love, some of the stuff I don't love as much, but this was really enjoyable. I had a really great time. So
I'm glad. It's my favorite show. So.
Oh, I love that. You have introduced me to quite a few interesting shows, friends. But for our listeners and viewers, our deuces, as we call them, who may not know who you are, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you, Ashton?
That's the real question to ask a philosopher. So I'm a philosophy grad student, an aspiring philosopher, I guess you could say. I don't have my PhD yet, so I can't say I'm a full Academy-approved philosopher. But I work in social ontology, which is the social construction of categories, like mostly disability, but also gender, race, class, these different sort of categories. I also do political philosophy, mostly all from a left-wing position. And I used to do theology. I still do theology in my blogs as well. I was a student at Bright Divinity School for a while before switching over to philosophy. I'm also autistic, an autistic self-advocate. So I worked with the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network as one of the fellows and did work there. And I was also the co-founder of Emmaus Center Church in Fort Worth, though I don't work there currently.
Awesome. I think we're having a little bit of, we're all having issues today. I think you're cutting out.
I wonder if this isn't like some sort of divine thing about like, you're talking about a show that is about people with issues. So like, this is actually symbolic. This is good.
I'm here for it.
Yeah.
It's a gift from God or the divine or whatever we want to call it. Maybe it's just gremlins in the system. I don't know.
But we are excited to have you. We're going to power through as we do. Because the audio is still there and that's great.
Cool.
So,
sounds good.
So why Bojack Horseman? Why is it your favorite show? What speaks to you about it?
So Bojack Horseman is interesting to me because it deals a lot with like issues that typically aren't dealt with a lot in shows, like depression, generational trauma, the power that men have systemically over women, things like that. But it does it from within the framework of a cartoon sitcom, and it's supposed to be a deconstruction of sitcoms. So the main character, Bojack Horseman, he used to be on a sitcom in the 90s within the show's universe called Horsing Around. And in that show, like it's the same sitcom thing. Everything turns out right in the end, but nothing ever like fully is right because you can't have a happy ending within a sitcom. It always has to keep going forward. And so it's a deconstruction kind of that idea that there's ultimately not a happy ending here. There's just a series of events that we have to exist in and exist through. And so it takes the sitcom idea of it always continues going to its logical conclusion, which I find really interesting.
I like that.
yeah.
It was fascinating. A friend of mine once told me about Full House, and he pointed it out, and it broke Full House. I never liked Full House, but they were like, think about how much the Tanners insist upon their lives being the center of everyone else's lives. And that's just because of the sitcom format. But if you watch it as they're all a bunch of like severe narcissists, it's a much more enjoyable show.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah,
but I don't think I've ever thought of a sitcom as not having like full resolution at the end, which I like that it doesn't. I like that you pointed out that this doesn't, because I think that especially as we, are kind of parlaying this conversation into what it can teach the church, I think often, and I don't know if y'all's experiences in this, but like our congregants in our churches want to wrap up a nice neat little bow at the end of every worship, every gathering, everything like that. And sometimes I've noticed that stops the momentum of the work that we are trying to do. We rarely at the end of worship say, and I'll see you on Wednesday for Bible study, or what, like that. We always do it up top at the beginning because we want to kind of have this moment at the end. And so what I guess my question is like, what might the church or our worship leaders learn from this intentional non-resolution?
Yeah, I think the church has a lot to learn here, mostly because I think too often the church puts emphasis on the meaning of suffering, or the idea that things have to have this end, this goal. But a lot of times in life, that's not the case, or it's actually problematic or harmful to assume that there is this like meaning or there's this end goal that we have. So Bojack deals a lot with the idea of what it calls like good damage, which is when you have trauma and you think that that trauma has to like mean something, that it has to be like there's a purpose for why you had that trauma, and so you have to put it into something. Like the character Diane has to write her book of essays about her trauma, because otherwise, what would it all mean? And a part of her journey is resolving that like she doesn't have to do that. She can do the things she loves and find happiness without like that being the goal, that she has to put something into her trauma. And I think that sometimes the church has a problem with wanting that same thing. It wants like the suffering of the world or the suffering of individual people to have some sort of purpose or meaning, but sometimes it just doesn't. And it's actually better if we don't think of it in those terms, that we actually are able to sit and exist in the suffering and recognize why it happens, but not necessarily try to put it on people that it then has to mean something, that we can grow in ways that understand the complexity of that trauma without saying that it has to then lead to a specific goal or a specific idea. And I think that that's something that the church can learn to avoid that, like these ideas of the meaning of suffering or the goal of what we're supposed to get to, and instead be able to exist within the space of that complexity and learn from it without attaching all these like heavy things to it, which ultimately tend to cause more harm than good, I think.
Sometimes trauma simply is.
Yes.
I like that.
I liked it a lot too. I mean, it's so the minute you said that about Diane, I was kind of looking for it, and I was watching that episode, whichever one it was, where she writes her, where she has to write her book of essays, and otherwise, what does it all mean? And I think that to allow it to simply be, the church has done some real harm in trying to justify trauma in spaces like that, where we're like, oh, but it had, Kate Bowler has that book, Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved, which is true, right? We like to justify these really awful things, and we like to justify them out of our scriptures too, and say, oh, well, this person did really bad things because look what it got us in the end, or whatever. And I mean, I think that goes right back to a lack of resolution, but also how harmful we have been to try and say, oh, this really terrible thing happened to you, but let's look for the bright side, or let's look for what it has taught us, or how can it function in a way that serves us rather than or serves you, the traumatized, like, rather than just letting it be and acknowledging its real sinful, terrible nature and letting that move forward.
Exactly, I agree. So I, in a blog post, talked about what I call Christian positivity versus theological negativity. So Christian positivity being this like idea, like you live your best life now, or like or you have like joy in God, or like there's some positive thing that you have to take away from Christianity, and it's always like pulling back to like, well, God is good, all these things are good, which in certain cases can be very helpful, like for some people, but in other cases, like where you experience this trauma, and especially when the trauma is actually tied to the church or tied to our understandings of God, it can be damaging to be like, no, that's not the case. It is actually good. Like God's actually good. That this world is actually good. It feels like gaslighting in many cases, because you're essentially saying that the experience that person has had is not like real. So you can both hold that like ultimately in some theological sense you believe in the goodness of God, but that these experiences of the church, of God, of your own suffering are also real, and they don't have to have like this thing attached to them that like makes your theology like more coherent. You don't have to like explain it in terms of the goodness of God or anything like that. You can let it be without adding this other layer to it that like makes ultimately the trauma of the person not about them and their experience.
It's because we don't think, but we act in such a way that only one thing can be true at a time.
Yes.
And that's actually sitcom reasoning right there. Is the A plot, there's the B plot. They will both be resolved in 22 minutes. And because there's no development, there's only resolution. inevitably that occurs. I can appreciate that. My new bingo phrase for 2021 is two things can be true at the same time. We're gonna see what happens. Can we talk about Mr. Peanut Butter for a second?
Always.
Yes. I'm
Yes.
sorry. He's my favorite character. I am in fact just three children stacked up on top of each other in a trench coat, like ontologically. That's why I've changed my name to Arthur Adultman on this call. But Mr. Peanut Butter is the best character. For those of you who have not seen the show, he is a anthropomorphic golden retriever who has a lot of characteristics of a golden retriever. He was meant to be the foil of Bojack Horseman and instead became really this much better character. Ran for governor, has his own problems. What was the name of his talk show? I wrote it down, but not here, and I've already closed out that. But it was celebrities. What do they know? Can they tell us?
Hollywood. Yeah. Exactly.
He develops outside of the sitcom trope. Do we make room for our foils, for the others, for those who are supposed to either make us better or make us worse? Do we leave room for them to stop being, how do we make room to stop comparing others to ourselves? Because I see the church do this with, that congregation's better, that congregation is worse. Christina Cleveland's Disunity in Christ talks about othering and the, I'm going to stop talking. You nodded like you know what I'm saying. I'm going to stop building on it. That's a bad habit.
Say the question again.
Yeah.
How do we break the othering comparative mold? How do we move out of, in order for me to have worth, that other person cannot have worth, or I do not have worth because that person has more perceived value?
You want to tie this to Mr. Peanut Butter specifically?
I do. I love Mr. Peanut Butter. And if you'd rather answer a different question that you just make up about Mr. Peanut Butter, I'm fine with
I'm cool with that. So I think my interest in Mr. Peanut Butter is specifically that he has this problem of wanting other people to be happy for him, which is part of that problem there, and it's this casting onto another. So Mr. Peanut Butter early on has this line where he says that that life is just finding meaningless things that make you happy until one day you're dead, and that's his motto in life. And it's interesting because that's kind of a frame in which he finds happiness, but he also causes harm, because once you apply that to other people, it doesn't work out as well once you're applying it to the other. So he has this constant string of failed marriages, and the main theme there being that it's because he can't deal with the complexity and the depressing emotions that come with that ultimately. The early stages of a relationship where you feel totally in love with the person, everything is great, the honeymoon period, he can do that very well. He's very he's a very happy, he's a good boy, he's a great dog. He can be very friendly and very fun, but once it comes to the point that his partners are dealing with their own complexity, like Diane's depression or her feelings of anxiety, or really anything that is not quite right within the relationship, his response is to try to be fun or to try to be happy in response to it instead of dealing with the problem. So he'll do grand gestures for Diane, even when she explicitly says that she doesn't like those, because for him, it's the thing that makes him happy. So it should make other people happy. So there's this sense of Mr. Peanut Butter where he appears at first as being the most friendly, good-hearted character. And to some extent he is. He's a very nice person. But there's also harm that he causes in being unable to deal with the complexity of the people around him and ignoring when there's actual problems, which is one reason I do find him a very interesting character. In the foil of Bojack, where Bojack will just say what he thinks is true and will deal with these bad characteristics, but is unable to feel any joy. So he's the opposite in that sense.
So is Mr. Peanut Butter kind of the congregational church in the 21st century?
Oh yeah, I think so.
Well, that's it.
Very happy but unable to deal with anything. Yeah.
Unwilling to let people grow past the simplicity into complex or nuanced characters.
Yeah. I really like Mr. Peanut Butter because the world in and of itself is really interesting, right? With these anthropomorphic animals that do and don't belong together, or in, you know, in our real life, wouldn't necessarily be in the same room, horses, penguins, and dogs, you know, just like hanging out. But I like that they have the character, like he's a good boy, right? Mr. Peanut Butter is a good golden retriever type dog, and yet so much more, and operates in the so much more. And which for me was really helpful, because it's like, okay, here's a very specific understanding of what a golden retriever is, how they act, who they are, how they identify like personality traits and things like that. And so let's start there and build off. And I think that when we get new people into the church, we are quick to characterize them and understand, are they a golden retriever or a penguin, you know, in a quick thing, and often don't say, and what is there more? What is the moreness that is to them? We kind of, we look for the animal characters and not the human characteristics of them when they come to our spaces. And so I guess, you know, how might the church better posture itself for that kind of hospitality, to allow people to develop and be more than the first judgment that we cast on them?
I think, so part of that in the interesting case of Mr. Peanut Butter is that as the show develops, it shows like why he developed this personality and like the pain that's a part of that. So he goes back to like, I forget if it's an island or if it's just like a part of like North America, which is like where all of the golden retrievers are. And so his family is from there. And they're all very, very happy. But the problem is that none of them talk about like the suffering that's happening around them. So one of his family members has like cancer and is dying, but that person won't tell him until later. And neither of them can actually like respond to it in the way that they want, like into the way that would be helpful for them to actually like feel that emotion. And I think that one thing that's good for the church to think about is that no one is like an island. No one like comes from nothing. Everyone has like a particular context that creates the personality that we perceive, which sometimes hides like this much, and typically hides this much larger iceberg underneath that is what their actual history is, what is actually like their past. So like with Mr. Peanut Butter, he might come into the church and you're like, oh, this person is like a happy-go-lucky person. He can be good in all these sorts of ways for the church. But the issue there is that if you ignore the fact of why that he is the way he is, you're just perpetuating harm on him and others as well. So whenever you see someone, it's okay to like we automatically will like create categories for people, and that's something that we can't necessarily avoid, even though we can try to try and like assuage that to some degree. But we should like reflect after that and think like, that's not the fullness of them, and like I can learn more about them over time instead of assuming that that's exactly who they are. And I think that that's especially something that needs to happen in the church, because my experience in the church is that people really want to put people in boxes so that they can do things in the church. Which it makes sense because the church needs people doing things. But the issue there is if you're not thinking about like the complexity of the person, then you're not actually getting like what you need or what they need. And so I think that's a stance that the church has to take as well.
Yeah, I really like that. And I totally agree. We don't allow that growth often to happen, and we need to, something that I coined a month ago, but it's like that hermeneutic of curiosity needs to lead in all spaces of the church, right? Like new people, why are we doing what we are already doing? How do we make room? You know, why are people coming to the church? Who are these people? What makes these people want to come here? All the questions that, you know, we think we know the answers to, we think we know other people's answers, and we have forgotten to ask the question. And I think that has been a big part of the decline of church, because it's, you know, we assume people are coming to us for the answers so that they don't have their own questions. And that's really problematic, because the church then doesn't grow as an institution. We only grow maybe as individuals, but like the goal is to grow as a communal body. Can we talk about Diane?
I agree.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, I think that's also particularly a problem when we're dealing with like marginalized people within the church, because whether we want to admit it or not, the church in North America, like the white mainline liberal church, is specifically the white church. It's specifically a very like cis heterosexual male dominated church. It's specifically a middle class church. And so wanting to expand that is very important. But the problem is I've perceived at least, especially in spaces where like I'm openly queer, I'm openly disabled, things like that. People are like, okay, you're queer, you're disabled. Here's the things that I know about that. I'm gonna run with it. Instead of thinking like these are really complex social categories, and this is a human being who like is marked by those categories, but isn't totally reducible to them. And I think like there's a really big problem in the church with people coming in, and you're like, oh, I'm so great to have like XYZ category of people in my church now. I can stop thinking about it and just accept that like whatever assumption I have that I'm attaching to them is okay. And I don't think that's a conscious process. I don't think people are just deciding that out of meanness. I think that's just something that we do that we need to reflect on and like actively challenge.
Yes.
That is interesting, because if we use identity as a box as opposed to identity as being, that will. So what were you going to say about Diane, dear Spiff?
So I love Diane. I thought I think I was really drawn to obviously the characters that are like more animal than human, or I don't know how they categorize that, but Diane caught my attention in really specific and interesting ways, especially as her own mental health grew. So something I really like about this show is that it addresses head on mental health, health in general, body shape, weight, all of the things. And so Diane, I really appreciate, as she addressed her own mental health challenges and became in a more healthy space, they drew her in the way her body would probably physically change in our world, knowing, what happens to bodies when they take certain medications or, do certain things. And I really appreciated that. Not only was it talked about and is mental health talked about explicitly throughout all 6 seasons, but that we got to see it physically change. Like so often it's like, here's the Xanax, here's the Wellbutrin, here's whatever, and then they're fine. And it's very clean and happy.
Because there's the string music at the end of the episode when everything's being resolved.
Because it resolves itself. And we see this we see health as a growing space and not an end space. And I really appreciate that. And I think the church must learn from that. I don't even think that's a can the church learn, but we must look at health as a space of continued growth and something that muscle that we have to exercise and practice and do rather than an end state of being. And I'm just wondering how that affect, or like what you all thought about that. If what's your experience in the church? I talk openly about having a therapist, let's say, and going to therapy, and I have been told to not do that. And I say I can't lead faithfully a congregation that doesn't know that I am taking care of myself. But there has been the stigma that needing help is not actually taking care of yourself and all of that. And so I don't know, what is Diane, how does Diane help us understand that, I guess, a bit more comprehensively?
Yeah, so I find this really interesting in the sense that like, so I'm pretty open about like, I'm autistic, I am dyspraxic, which means that my body has some motor function, quote unquote, problems. My body just moves differently, basically. And also I have PTSD, so I have a lot of certain mental health struggles. The thing that comes along with that is like particular perceptions of my body, particular changes in my body from medication, but also very importantly, a perception of how other people perceive my body. So like George Hegel in Pathology of Spirit talks a lot about how our self-consciousness, our understanding of ourself, does not arise just from ourself, but from like the gaze of the other, the way that other people look at us. And so I think that's really important here with Diane's character and with our talking about how our bodies are. It's not just like about like the simple like perception of our body itself or about like the state of our body at any one time. It's about like how we understand ourselves within that body and also how other people understand us and how like that can be beneficial or it can be harmful. So like Diane doesn't want to necessarily like appear in certain ways, like have her body to appear in certain ways that are typical for people who are on antidepressants. And that's not necessarily, what's interesting about that is it's not necessarily because it's bad for her, it's because the way other people would perceive her, the way that society is structured in such a way to perceive people with certain bodies. And that's something that I experience a lot. My body moves in very particular ways. I've gone through like testing where people are like, he like has a very like rigid way of moving. He like has a very monotone form of speech. And it's very interesting because that's part of how we construct mental health and health in general in the United States at least, but in the globe generally, at least in certain privileged spaces within the globe, the global north. And I think that it's important to think like not only like what effects are going to occur and how can we accept those specific effects, but how can we change the way we talk about bodies and the way that we like interact with other people with bodies. So everyone has a body until the robots take over. But like in doing that, how can we better help like how the gaze of the other is perceived? How can we help people with non-normative bodies actually feel that they are within this space? And how do we understand that our own body is always like against the grain of the normative, that no body ultimately achieves the perfection that capitalism wants to put on us, but instead that we all exist in spaces where like our bodies are in some way against the grain, and how can we accept not only our body but the bodies of others?
Mm-hmm.
I like that.
I think, well, and I think too, it's, you know, you'd mentioned the white mainline church. It considers itself the church, or rather, the white church considers itself the church. And I can only really speak to the disciples, but like we don't refer to the General Assembly as the white assembly, but there's a convocation, and I know it's far more complex, Biff, and I'm not trying to say anything that would get you or the marvelous leadership of the disciples.
We're allowed to speak freely, but yeah, speak for yourself. You're good.
I'm speaking for myself in this. That's a better way to put it. We understand we have the not the ecclesia. We have different racial representations, but we do not say that the constructed identity of whiteness is something that is defined or delineated. So we have this default idea within the normative typology of how bodies work. We don't then consider that we see things outside of the default. And I'm saying back to you what I'm hearing, and forgive me on that. I've been thinking a lot about the body of Christ as a larger metaphor because it annoys me the more I think about it, because it requires a lot of inclusive action and a very expansive understanding of what a body does, is, or becomes. And we lose out, again, Cleveland's disunity in Christ. We lose out when we are excluding parts of ourselves. And also too, I'm sorry, back to your initial point, Spiff, on the conveyance of that which we shouldn't talk about. I use a lot of recovery community language. I don't always overtly say I'm in recovery because it's not mine to represent. And if I fall off the wagon, I do not want people to think that the program I participate in is somehow represented by my failures nor my successes. It's not. When directly saying I'm part of the recovery community, and there are times where I just have very alcoholic thinking, which I know is not a physical manifestation, but sometimes it's up there. It's fascinating because, yeah, there is that idea of like, we're not supposed to talk about that. We're not supposed to live into that. And it's drawing that as a process, that we are people we're human becomings rather than human beings. I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm just blah at y'all. And
no, I think I think you're going back to us, you know, putting people in boxes, right? Not allowing the expansiveness of your health and growth. You know, like we want to say, oh, Arthur's in recovery. I wonder, you know, what got him there, how, you know, all the things that are of that identity for you, rather than saying, wow, look at someone who is taking control of their life, trying to grow, you know, be healthy and grow and figure that out. And what you know, what an exceptional space of leadership that may turn into for our people, or for me, or for churches, or whatever, you know, the spaces. I know I'm talking specifically about you. I'm talking about like
Well, yeah,
Every
and it's I'm sorry, it's letting the narrative play out not as a means to an end, but just a means. And I think that really comes back to the whole point of Bojack Horseman. There's not I did like that the finale was like everybody got married, but it wasn't she got off the plane and went back to see Ross. By the way, still waiting for someone to say they want to take on Friends because it's the worst show ever made.
Oh, it's horrible.
Like
I hate it.
let's do it. Come on, but it's
especially
not.
we've got the new
Yeah, we can call that 2-on-1, the one where Arthur hates Friends.
Yeah, no, this whole show is so well done, and down to like the animation of it and how it's deconstructed. It made me think, as I was watching some of those episodes, it made me think a lot about so I like to think of my ministry in like multiple senses, right? Like 5 sense ministry. I created a scent for my church so that, you know, as your olfactory senses are some of the best for recollection. And so I was like, if we give everyone a candle and we make this candle the scent of the church, when they light it, they will think of the church. And so I like to think about how to do that for lots of my different ministries. And my favorite episode that for deuces out there, Ashton gave us like a list of like 12 episodes. So I watched, I think 10 of them. I feel like I got through that list pretty well. But I think my favorite episode is the one where they're underwater and there is like almost no talking. And until the very end when he realizes he could have been talking, which is a whole other thing, which I really like. But so this, you have an episode about going into a different community and a different culture and a different way of literally being, because he's a horse underwater. And there is nothing said really, you know, like that we understand as words, let's say, and yet there's an entire story that is told, and there is emotion, and there is nuance, and there is connectivity, and it was really meaningful. And it made me think about the worship spaces that we do, and how, especially myself as a preacher, and I like to think of myself as a preacher, I like to preach, and I can be very loquacious, and it's, you know, in all spaces of my life, shocking. And so but what, you know, how are we showing up in like the physicalness of what we preach and what we are and who we hope to be? How is that understood when nothing is said? And I've thought a lot about that as we're thinking about coming back into our church. We are still worshiping online right now, and so all my people see of me and my stuff is this, and that is intentional. But when we come back together, like, what are the ways in which we say something about our relationship to God, our relationship to community, without actually using words? And what meaning that brings to so many people as we try and expand what we're doing, as you know, building the kingdom, or whatever vision of why you go to church or why you belong to a faith community. And so I don't know, what are y'all's experiences with churches or people, you know, not saying something but saying something?
So for me, whenever topics like this come up, I think about, like, I have many friends in the autistic community who are non-speaking, but they do communicate. The issue being that, like, people don't want to engage with the way that they communicate, or don't accept the way that they communicate. Even when it's very available to them, like, even if it's not a problem, people just won't accept that it's a form of communication. And I think a problem there with the church is that also, like, if you set it up that it's like speaking in words are the only form of communication you have with God, that's completely denying the theological worlds of people like that, whose main forms of communication and expression are not through spoken language. And just in general, for people who, like, feel their religious world in like non-verbal, non-spoken ways, which I think can apply to many people. So I am thinking about this question. I'm thinking about the ways that, like, maybe the church should think about how, like, embodied ritual is used, and the way that we talk about, like, the communication of God to people. 'Cause it's too often that we think of God as God speaking to us, or God like Christ being the word, or things like that, which of course is found in scripture, but also, like, can sometimes deny the different variants and the complexity of how people experience the church and God and the world in ways that are not necessarily tied to like spoken language. I think that's a very difficult thing for the church to do because it's like rooted in the tradition, like this focus on the spoken word or words in general. But it's something that has to be done to actually like incorporate the way that people live religious life and religious life worlds, which is as a complex, embodied way of being that is not necessarily tied to one form of communication.
Yeah, I like that. As I was thinking about that, I was like, what would happen if we show up to the communion table and don't do the words of institution, but literally hold up a loaf of bread, break it, put, show it out to the people, put it down, and welcome people forward without a word, like the ritual in and of itself speaks volumes, but also if you're new to that space, you don't necessarily get the entire nuance. And so that's why I think community is important, because then it can be like, hey, however you speak, we're a multilingual church, and so for us it's important that we have lots of different people that speak the language, both the insider language and the like actual like spoken language, like Spanish, English, that type of language, but also just like when we say all are welcome, what does that really mean, right? Like, because language is nuanced as well, even just language is nuanced. And so yeah, I don't know. I was thinking about, as I was watching that episode, that where no one talks and yet there is love and there is compassion. And it's one of the first episodes that I saw where Bojack really like is compassionate. I mean, he's got that little seahorse baby, and it's cute, and it's and he cares for it, and he has frustration over it, and you kind of run that gauntlet of the human complexity or horse complexity that without saying anything, and I was really moved by that.
I think too with word, I can't remember the patriarch from the 4th or 5th century who translated logos as conversation rather than word, and it's conversant. And I think about like just simply to plug ourselves with 2-on-1, we create an intentional space. There's boundaries, there's the means to participate, and we always tell our guests before we go live, this is not an interview, it's a conversation. That has seemed to work to our benefit since we started saying that, because there's a difference between having an interview and a conversation. To have a conversation implies the active consent and knowing of the other who is in said conversation, or at least to have a holy one. And I think building on that, there becomes the misattributed quote to St. Francis, preach the gospel at all times, when necessary use words, which may better say convey the divine within you, and if you have to talk, do it, I guess. But there it is. So may I pivot, if that's okay, just a little bit? Okay, so my favorite character is Mr. Peanut Butter, especially because his first name is Mr. But my second favorite character has to be Vincent Adult Man. But I don't necessarily want to talk about Vincent Adult Man. I want to talk about the chicken boo like honesty, forthrightness. I don't know if I know the right word of Bojack saying that is clearly 3 children standing on each other's shoulders or sitting on each other's shoulders, and no one else seems to notice or mind or care. Is that Bojack being prophetic? Where is the prophetic role in Bojack Horseman?
That's interesting. So I made a Facebook post not too long ago how Vincent Adult Man is just the Trinity. It's just 3 persons standing on top of each other in a trench coat.
You should have kept asking the
that,
final answer.
Is that
that's true?
Is that public? Because I need to A, be your friend on Facebook, and B, preaching Trinity Sunday this Sunday. That's
we all maybe
I can make that one post public. Yeah.
Forgive me. Please continue. I'm sorry to have interrupted.
Oh, it's all good. But yeah, I find it's really interesting because there's this like idea of the honesty of just pointing out something that's obviously true, which I do think is a prophetic role to some extent, in the sense that like we exist in spaces where there's things that are obviously like true, but we can't speak of them or we can't talk of them. Because to do so would disrupt the way that we live in the world and disrupt our illusions. So like I think especially within systems of oppression, for example, it's not hidden. Like the violence of the system that we exist in is not necessarily a hidden thing. Some of the forms of oppression are subtle, but a lot of it's just very like clear if you're actually looking at it. And I think that there's a role there for prophecy in the sense that like you point out the thing that people know, but they're not willing to talk about. Of course, this is a much more like it's a less serious form within Bojack, talking about Vincent Adult Man. But I do think that there's that role there that he's just like, yeah, we all know this, right? And everyone being like, nah, this is Adult Man. He goes to the business factory every day.
Well, and what if they do know? I've always likened the table to professional wrestling, actually semi-professional wrestling, or to a drag show, right? Like you know that Activia Spencer is not actually singing Somewhere Over the Rainbow, but by God, she is in that moment. You know that wrestling is scripted and there's still very much real stuff, and there's very much the agreed upon, I'm not going to say lie, the agreed upon truth that thus becomes truth because it is accepted. And that's probably a much too dangerous way, but perhaps they do know and they just accept Vincent Adult Man for who he is, where he is, which might bring us back to the whole categorization thing. He has a broom for a hand. He breaks categorization of bodies, which is also just my favorite because that's a child's logic. Well, I need something sticking out of the coat.
It's very good.
But I do think he's a real person who goes to the business factory. I like his son, Kevin.
Well, and I like that there's something to be said about the prophetic nature of just truth, right? I mean, like is Bojack a prophet? Sure. I mean, are we all not prophets in our own spaces of truth? I mean, like if, yeah. And so like, you know, we want to say, oh, but Bojack has all of these issues, right? Like, oh, Bojack is not the prophet we want, but maybe the prophet we need. And so, which I think is true of all of these characters and all of our selves.
That makes him the Dark Knight.
That was terrible.
God.
But yes.
I would say the box right there.
But yes, well done. But you know, so there's something there too, I think, of that. Also, like, is it Todd? Is Todd the roommate?
Yeah. Yeah,
he's great. I was watching an episode last night and he said something and I don't even remember what it was, but I was like, oh, I need to rewatch that because he was just like, it's like it's like maybe episode 10 of season 6 or something like that. But like Todd's funny and grows and I think shows the complexity of human sexuality as well in through his identity as in ace culture and all of that. And I really appreciated, I mean, the show just keeps giving it to you, but there's truth to all of it. And I bring Todd up in this space because it's like there is prophetic truth in his own witness as well. And I think that every character has that. Even oh gosh, what Amy Sedaris is the cat, Princess Carolyn. Princess Carolyn, yes.
Carolyn.
Princess Carolyn is also like there's something where it was like Bojack comes back and he's like everyone's left and she's like we're still here, like I'm still here because you make life better, you make this space better for me, you know, I was in love with you for years and all of that. And there's very much truth there of like we're with the people that we are with because we see value in them and their value is their truth, and when we share that authentically that becomes a holy space. And I think that this show does that so well, even amidst the spaces where we have been told the holy cannot dwell.
I like that. So it reminds me of like during Bojack's soliloquy at his mother's funeral, when he's speaking at his mother's funeral, he talks about like how awful his like childhood is, but he also talks about how like he talks about it in a way where he says that like they were all drowning, but they were drowning together. And I think that there's something profound in that. Like even in spaces where you exist with like in spaces of trauma where you don't know how to help other people, you still exist in spaces with them. Of course, it gets complex because his like parents were very abusive, and there's a way that like it's you don't want to like tie them together. Obviously, you want to be able to like explicate them to some extent, but there is a sense in which they're all tied through this like generational history, this generational trauma that brings them together, even while they don't know how to change that cycle. And I think in many ways, human beings are like that. We don't know necessarily how to solve a lot of the big problems, even though we try, but we're still here together. And that's a really important thing in itself.
Yeah, I love the generation. I almost said I love the generational trauma. That's not what I mean. But I love how it is portrayed in this kind of like laid on effect ghost form, right? Like you have like the timelines that exist simultaneously to show how one person's action within your hereditary, your yeah, I guess what you've inherited.
It's a story that repeats itself unless you actively do not repeat it.
Yeah, and I love how Bojack Horseman as a show, not just as an individual character, but as a show, does that really beautifully to say, and I think everyone gets it. You get the Princess Carolyn, fast forward to like the great granddaughter vision, which all that, like the timeline is not static, because the timeline is not static and for any of us, and it's a really nice reminder that that all of these things exist at once, that we do exist in the here and now, but we also exist within the construct of a very malleable time construct, and that the things that have informed us and informed those who informed us are still present. Dun, 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 dun.
Excuse me.
Yeah. I was gonna say, as part of that, I wanted to bring up one topic that I think that we should touch on while we're doing this. And that's like one of the big themes of Bojack is the power that men have over women in complex ways. It's a very big theme in Bojack that like a lot of this trauma occurs because of cycles of patriarchy and cycles of patriarchal violence. So in Bojack's own like family history, his father is like a wealthy man, very well respected man in his community. But a lot of the things that he does, the misogynistic violence that he does, is what causes a lot of the trauma going forward. So Bojack's grandmother, Honey, she is a very kind and like very joyous woman until her child dies in World War II. And understandably, that causes PTSD symptoms. She like has to express her grief in some way. And in a society where 1940s, 1950s, around there, where women aren't allowed to really express that grief, she acts in ways that like people perceive as just like totally like impossible. Like she drinks, she like cries in public, things like that. And Joseph Sugarman, like Bojack's grandfather, his response is a lobotomy. He actually lobotomizes the grandmother of Bojack, Honey Sugarman. And the last thing that she says to her daughter, Beatrice, who is Bojack's mother, before she is lobotomized, is to never love someone as much as she loved Cracker Jack, who was her son. And it's that cycle of like violence which is like important here. Like Beatrice appears as like a really like cold and like mean mother, and like she is, but also like there's a reason for it. There's like she was like always castigated for like going outside of the roles of women. She was always told that her body was not thin enough. She was always like not allowed to express herself. Her like dolls were like burned, and like given her like emotions were given no like a way to escape. And it was repeated as well in her like marriage to Bojack's father, who was a very like physically abusive and bigoted man. And so like, and it's interesting to me that like one of the main themes of the last season of Bojack deals with like how Bojack thinks of himself in many ways as outside of that he wasn't like part of that cycle of violence, that he's better than it. But as like the interviewer says in one of the episodes, like, you don't think you have power over women, even though he like is part of the cycle that helped cause the death of Sarah Lynn. He chokes Gina during the filming of Filbert. He contributes to a lot of these structural harms and just direct personal harms to women that he thinks of himself as explicated from it. I think that's important to note, because a lot of times, especially people in progressive spaces, people in liberal spaces, like to think of themselves as outside of those systems of violence. Well, they're not Joseph Sugarman. They're not lobotomizing people. but so they must not have power over women. Like, but that's not the case. And I think that that's important to point out. And to see like where these systems of violence still occur within the church and other institutions, and how we can like combat them in like actually effective ways that consider the histories behind them.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you bringing that up, because it's I mean, and that's apparent from episode 1, right? So you have Princess Carolyn, who is both his ex-girlfriend and agent. And so, and like in that the first time you really meet her, she's all mad at Bojack because he's been awful to her, has said really awful things to her, has done awful things to her. And then she leaves and then calls him immediately in agent mode. And how women have to operate in these spaces in the both, and as like we still have to operate and exist within really terrible systems with with our oppressors and with those that perpetuate violence against us, because we feel called to do the work, right? Because we haven't been allowed to do the work in healthy and sustainable ways. They had to be unhealthy to be sustainable. We had to prove that we could push through being yelled at and demeaned and, you know, all of that, to show that we are just like the boys and can do the work just as well or whatever. And I appreciate that theme, and how it deconstructs itself throughout the series, and how spaces grow and how some are still just as awful, and yet, but it doesn't go unaddressed. And I really appreciated that naming that is part of how we will deconstruct it within the church or within our ministries or within our relationships, to say, I don't have to be both and. I can just be the space in which is healthiest for me. And I think that I don't know, Bojack just does that really well.
I want us to stay cognizant of our time, if we may, and we need to move to our last question. At this point, Spiff asks it better than I do, so I'm going to defer to her.
I don't know if I ask it better, but I do it.
You ask it more frequently.
I do ask it more frequently. Ashton, thank you so much for being here. And this has been a really rich conversation about the depth and nuance of Bojack Horseman, which is not, when you look at a cartoon, you don't think necessarily that that's going to be what this is about, but have really appreciated you bringing this to our, 2-2-on-1, which is why we let our guests pick their own topics. If you would like to be a guest out there, any of our deuces, get a hold of us, go to the website, 2on1project.com, let us know, and come on down. But as is our tradition, our final question, and you will get to answer first, is what biblical narrative, theme, character, book are you most reminded of in Bojack Horseman?
So I was trying to think about this, and the first thing that came to mind was Ecclesiastes, like this sort of like absence of meaning, absence of like a specific like role that God necessarily plays, like this sort of like the way that God appears as in some ways a very like other being, and I think that does have some role in Bojack. But what I think I want to bring out is more the theme of like where it invites us to like look at the actual violence that occurs, and not necessarily to so it doesn't give us necessarily a reason that it happened always, and it doesn't necessarily like have to be justified. Like I think that too often we want to justify the violence that occurs within Scripture or the bad things that occur within Scripture, but the Bible doesn't necessarily do that. It does in some senses, and like this was written many times by people who committed these acts or like approved of these acts, not always, but sometimes. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to, or that God approves of it, or necessarily that like what is most just within the Scripture is the thing that occurs. Like when violence and bigotry and horrible things happen in the Bible, we can look at them and recognize them as such without trying to say, well, it was justified in this way, or it has this grander meaning, or this grander contribution to something. We can just see it as this was a bad thing that we have to like recognize and learn from. And I think that that's part of the thing I want to bring out of Bojack as well, that we don't have to like justify Bojack's actions because he's horrible in many ways, but we can like recognize also like what happened, that was bad, what the context of that is, and try and learn from it without justifying it.
Have you read God Knows by Joseph Heller, where he does the autobiography of David on his deathbed? And God
I haven't.
barely speaks in the novel, but God only asks questions. And one of God's continuous ones is, why do you need an explanation for this? Just made me think of that. I'm going to go for 2 Corinthians in answer to our question.
What?
Yeah.
Are you doing a study of Corinthians?
I'm doing a study of Corinthians, but what I like about 2 Corinthians is it's an ongoing process. We mistake it for one letter. It's at least two. I'm personally of the 4 school, because it would annoy Victor Furnish, and he annoys me. But it's an ongoing, continual thing. So they're naming in the context of what is happening. And of course, we took it and said, this male should be indisputable canon and not the best choice for us. But if we, in its origins, that's where it becomes. There doesn't have to be a resolution. There can't be a resolution in order for it to actually resolve. Spiel?
Yeah. Sorry, I had a cat come in here who was yelling at me. So I'm gonna go with Psalm 34. Because Psalm 34's title is of David when he pretended to be insane before Abimelech, who drove him away and he left. And I like that one, because there's part of it that's like, there's something about the ever presence of God that when we call out, God is there. And I think in Bojack, there's lots of different ways in which all the characters are continuously reaching out, and their needs are met if they know where to look, or if they open up their understanding of how help can come. But also that, David, this psalm, he pretended to be insane is really unhealthy and a really unfair and terrible way of utilizing an understanding of mental health to get to resolve something, rather than speaking that truth to power. And I think the Bojack does that a lot, and lots of people do, right? We all lean into some really unhealthy spaces, unhealthy tropes, to benefit the outcomes that we hope come. And so for me, that kind of just was like, oh, this is an interesting use of mental health, of what health writ large looks like, and how it can be both used and weaponized to resolve the needs of the church, the needs of a show, and all of that. So that's what I got for you.
All right. Well, this has been 2 on 1. Ashton Sorrels, thank you very, very, very much for joining us today, especially with all of the gremlins in our system trying to keep us down. But boom, here we are. I need to pull up our little promo for our sponsor, which is Jeff One Row Designs. They're celebrating 16 years of making ordinary time extraordinary. And we are very thankful that Jeff and his team are continuing to sponsor us. There we are. Go to Jeff Wunrow, JEFFWUNROW.com. Check out their catalog, customization options, and use a code 2on1 at checkout. We don't have anything to announce for next week because we're not ready to do so, but
we're working on it.
Yeah. Subscribe, like, share, talk to people about this. Ashton, you've been a marvelous guest. Thank you so much for taking time with us today.
Thank you.
Yes. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
We'll see you later, deuces.